So just to start, obviously spring 2020 was challenging. I know that for a lot of the schools that I've spoken with over the last several months, you know, they're definitely in survival mode. You know, what can we do to get our students through the end of the year successfully, or as successfully as we can? And I know that for a lot of you, the coming school year still looks pretty uncertain. So there may be limits to how much planning that you can do. But I think one thing that you can do is think about your structures for reviewing data in the coming school year. So the goal of this session is going to be to take some time to think about, you know, like our opening framing, your goals for looking at data in the 2021 school year, and then start to think about the first meeting or two that you might want to have once the school year starts, so that you're ready with those first steps. There we go. So to start, we're going to return to our Padlet. Data meetings can be really challenging for lots of reasons, both as someone who organizes them or as someone who just participates in them. So the first thing I want to do is just brainstorm what are some challenges that you see when you either run data meetings or attend data meetings. And again, we're going to hop back to our trusty Padlet. And I see you guys have already hopped in, so that's great. Yeah, I'm seeing some great stuff already. Like, how do we make these sorts of meetings feel important when there's so much else going on? Yeah, lack of engagement. Teachers want me to do all the analysis rather than engaging with the data themselves. Where to find it and cleaning it up. Yeah, and again, if you have comments or just want to show that this is something you're also thinking about, please, feel free to note it. Yeah, making analysis easy and then making a clear action plan to actually use. So like, you spend a lot of time digging into the data, but what's next? Let's take about one more minute and then we'll hop back to our next step. Okay, we can shift back. All right, and then let's talk about the wins. So I think one of the things that has come up already in both questions is how do we engage other people in this data work? And I think in order to do that, we need to take a second to think about like why do we spend all this time looking at data? What wins have we seen that come out of really good data review?
And for those of you who are just joining, you can find the link to this Padlet in the Whova chat. That's awesome. When school leaders ask for specific data, I know they will use it.
And I think attendance data can be a very powerful data source to be like, okay, this is the student that needs support. Being able to follow up with them. All right. Yeah, knowing where to access data is I think a great data win. We'll take one more minute here. Yeah, getting students in on the conversation is always a great data win, having students that feel ownership over their own data. Oh, I think this comment is a great point. So our data team likes to ask school leaders how they're going to use data because we might be able to give them data in another way to get what they want to find out. I think that's a great question that especially if you're the person on your team who processes and distributes the most data. Sometimes people know that they need data but don't know exactly how to ask for what they want. So it's always good to take a second and try to understand how it will be used eventually so it's the right data points. And sometimes you might already have something that's easier to access than the bigger thing that a school leader might ask for. I think that's a really good point. All right.
Awesome. So thank you all for sharing some of your data challenges and wins on the Padlet. It's really cool to see everybody sort of interacting with each other. So today, as Marlene mentioned, we're going to share one framework that you can use to address some of the common roadblocks that were raised to running data meetings in schools. So this framework, as you can see on the slide here, consists of 4 elements. So determining key questions, defining ownership and responsibility in schools for answering those questions, carving out time for review, which we know is a lot easier said than done in busy school schedules, and then finally ensuring that everyone has access to the data that they need to answer these questions. And what we usually see when implementing these 4 components is that they generally lead to 2 things. They lead to more questions, which is a great effect of a good, healthy data review process, and also to actions. And these actions can often be really small, like calling a specific student or starting a homeroom initiative to address a pattern that you're seeing in the data. But the really cool compounding effect of these continuous strategic actions can often lead to improved student and school performance over time. So we hope that this framework, going through this framework today is a helpful exercise as you start to think about what your school's review processes will look like this summer and next year. Perfect. So before we dive into these 4 essential elements, we're going to spend a few minutes reflecting on the data that your school already tracks. So this can be a good way to think about the kinds of information that's important to your school. So some of these data points might be really small, like student email addresses, or they might be pretty broad, like attendance. Some types of information may not have been that important to your school before this past spring, and now it might be very important. And so taking that time to assess the importance of certain data is valuable because there's not always direct overlap in what gets measured and what is actually critical to student and school success. So understanding the measures that are most important to your school can really help focus the questions you're asking of your data and the kinds of data you're prioritizing for review. You may also think about things that you want to start tracking or track differently in the upcoming year. So on the Padlet, and it's awesome, I see that people have already jumped in. You'll see a column with the title, "What are some types of data your school tracks?" We'll move over to this board. There's already some information here, so student engagement, PBIS, attendance, communication. So please take a moment to add as many data points as you can think of that your school tracks, and continue using that comment and heart feature as you see things that overlap with your school. Awesome. So seeing some great ones here. So community service, formative assessment results, seeing a lot of attendance. Students engaging in virtual learning, definitely a big one this year. Internet access. Yeah, so some reflection on an area that folks may want to start tracking this year. So this social emotional development, iReady data. Awesome. So we'll take about 1 more minute to continue generating these areas. Parent satisfaction. It's a really interesting one. Awesome. So if you still have more, feel free to continue adding. I'm going to turn it back over to Marlene, who's going to talk about how we can use these focus areas to generate key questions that we want to ask of our data.
Yeah, so let's talk about key questions. I think this was already brought up in the Padlet, but we don't collect data for the sake of collecting data. We collect data to answer questions. So whenever you're doing a data review process, it's a good idea to take a step back and think about what questions do you have about your students, about your school, that could potentially be answered with the data that you collect. We started with brainstorming the data we collect because I think that's a good way to get, ideas flowing about what is possible. But now we're going to transition to questions. So here's some sample data points. I think a lot of them came up already in the Padlet in the work that we were doing. So for the next activity, what we're going to do, and this is just a little bit different from what we've been doing before, is pick a data point that you or someone else listed on the Padlet, and then use the comment feature in that column with some questions that you have about the data. And so when we say questions that you have about the data, it might be something like, if we're talking about communication, you might have a question like, which students don't have a communication logged for a certain period of time? So again, shifting back to the Padlet, you can sort of scroll through and you can see Jill has added communication logs as a data point, and someone already commented, what is the communication for? So maybe like what kinds of communication are students receiving, so we can get a more qualitative look at the communication that students are receiving. So yeah, just like that, go ahead and comment with more specific questions you have about data. And the more specific we can get, the better, because we really want to come up with small questions that could be answered by our teams by digging into the data that we collect. I'm going to add a question to virtual learning.
I'm seeing one under family engagement and student behavior. Are parents getting only bad news? That seems like a really important one to ask if we're, we're really focused on building trust and open lines of communication with families.
Yeah, so let's take about 1 more minute, and if you can add a couple more questions that you might want to answer this school year with your data. Okay, so hopping back to our PowerPoint, you can see I filled in some questions for communication. We picked communication as the example during this session because I think that for a lot of schools, communication data is something that had been tracked, but maybe was less relied on as a vital data point to understand how your students are doing. And I think with virtual learning, likely how you engage with students and families outside of the building will be a huge part of how you assess how students are doing and whether they're receiving the support that they need. So we added questions like, which students don't have a communication logged for a certain time period? Are advisors contacting all of their advisees? Do certain groups of students have fewer communications logged than others? As well as a couple other questions. So these were just things that we thought about when it came to communication. You can definitely continue to add your questions to the Padlet if you think of things, but we're going to move on to the second piece, which is clear ownership.
Great. So now that we've talked about generating some key questions, we're going to talk about setting clear owners for certain types of review questions. And we feel like this can really help with 2 challenges that often arise when schools are trying to build their data culture. So something that we see a lot is school leaders might generate all of these questions to ask about their data, but then feel really overwhelmed by the thought of trying to answer and act on all of them. So they feel like they're responsible for every single piece of data, every single analysis project, and that's a lot. That's really overwhelming. And oftentimes when school leaders feel like they're exclusively responsible for analyzing all this data, others in the school might be feeling a lack of ownership at the same time. So in cases where teachers feel like they are entering all of this data, but it's not really for them. And we feel like this is the piece that can really lead to this data meetings feel evaluative feeling, or data is just being used to judge me, or I'm recording all this data, but I don't really know what is happening with it. And so by dividing key questions across multiple staff groups and spreading out that feeling of ownership, it can be a lot easier to see data review as something that's manageable, and also to see data itself as one of the many tools that can help drive actions to support students. So if we take a look at this chart, still kind of going with this student communication focus, when there's shared ownership of data in a school, questions can be matched with the staff members that have the most context about certain student groups and have the most ability to develop and implement action plans. So in this example, looking at communication from a high level, teachers are the ones that are keeping track of how communication is going with students in their homerooms or advisories, as they're the ones that are going to have the most context on how those students are doing and how to best reach their families. This then positions school leaders to look at broader trends and develop action plans or initiatives at the student group, grade, or school level. It's kind of spreading it out depending on sort of who we're looking at in terms of communication. So at this point, we're going to return to the Padlet, and look at some of the questions that we generated in the prior step. So you'll see this new column that says pick a question you have about your data and match it with an owner. And I've just moved over that question, which students don't have a communication logged for a certain time period. And maybe a school leader might say, oh, I really need to know sort of on an individual level, like which kids aren't being contacted. But really, if we kind of put this responsibility and this ownership on teachers, so I'm going to say homeroom teachers in here, like they're the ones that are generally making the calls, and they're the ones that can be responsible for seeing who needs to get that outreach. And if they're the ones sort of monitoring this data, it might feel a little bit less evaluative than a school leader being like, you need to, contact these 5 kids. It's more of a team effort. So please take a moment to, find a question in that column to the left that is interesting to you, move it over, and then populate it with who you think is best equipped in your school to answer that question. Awesome. So I'm seeing for students who are most at risk, the MTSS coordinator may be the sort of point person on that. Low GPAs and grades or teacher grade level teams. Yeah, really taking a lot of that student specific data and setting up routines and processes to enable teachers and grade level leads and grade level chairs to really, be responsible for that information and developing plans for that information. Yeah, I think attendance is a really big one because so many people in a building may have sort of responsibility or ownership for, hitting school attendance goals on a number of different levels. Great. So we're seeing a lot of different people in the school sort of responsible for different buckets of data. So I'm seeing the Dean of Culture for PBIS, seeing teachers, grade level teams, instructional coaches. The more people we can get invested in these processes, sort of the more questions can be answered and the more action planning can be done. Great, so feel free to just continue adding to this column as we move it back over to the third step in our framework. So before we do that, there's some examples of how Marlene and I connected our key questions about communication to different groups of educators. So you can see for our communication questions, we also have a broad range of people in a school who may be focusing on different components of questions related to communication. So we have teachers looking at, student level data, grade level chairs looking at student level and sort of like advisory group level. And then when we're getting to those questions that may lead to larger school initiatives, we're seeing the Dean of Students, the assistant principals, and the Dean of Students really kind of diving into those questions.
All right, so question number 3, dedicated time for review. This is a big one. Definitely came up in the challenges, especially it seemed around like, how do we get teachers to spend time looking at data when they already are so busy? Really big question. And so the way that we think about this is, how can we rethink data review so that every time we look at data, it doesn't have to be like this huge, like 2-hour-long meeting where we have this like giant, overwhelming spreadsheet that like we feel like we're starting from scratch with every time. That was definitely something that I experienced as a teacher. Was like looking at data meant like doing a huge process from beginning to end. And you don't have time for that all the time. So I think one thing that can help with this is taking those key questions and matching them to who will look at them. So we've already done that. And then really thinking about how long we need to spend and how often we need to look at these questions. And there may be some things that don't require an hour or 2 of your time. There may be things that you can do regularly and more quickly. So we have 2 examples here. So who received no communication this week? How can we ensure that these students have touch points with our school this week? So this key question, we said that homeroom teachers can own it. And one way that you could address this is having homeroom teachers spend 5 to 10 minutes looking at the students in their homeroom who have not received communication this week, and then just making a quick plan for when they're going to reach out to them. And that could be done in 5 to 10 minutes weekly. They can take that information and they can make their calls. Or are students in all groups, gender, race, ethnicity, home language, etc., receiving certain rates of communication? How do we address any differences? And again, this could be something looked at for 15 to 30 minutes monthly by the leadership team, so that you can, take a look at any discrepancies and then make a quick plan for what you're going to try between now and the next meeting to even out those rates. So what we'll do next is think about, for our questions, how often you'll address them. Oops, sorry. I'm getting ahead of myself. Here we go. For your students' highest priority questions, how often will you address them, and how much time is needed to address them? So we'll sort of take the same strategy that we took before, and we'll ask you to go back to the Padlet and comment on a question from the farthest to the right column, and comment with when and how often you'd want to review this data. So we'll jump back to the Padlet now. There we go. And Jill has given us an example here. So for which students don't have communication log for certain teachers, homeroom teachers, 5 to 10 minutes for review.
Cool. So I'm seeing a comment for weekly on attendance review with the social worker and data manager for something that's super important. It seems like weekly touch points are a great idea.
Yeah, I think so. I think this is a good point here. So for like low GPAs, meeting bi-weekly so that you can create action plans and give action plans time to work.
I think something else that can be really helpful here is instead of thinking about like what data review meetings do I need to add, sort of flipping it and saying like what meetings do we have on the calendar already, what meetings are scheduled that we can implement some data routines in. So it's not feeling like we're adding all this additional time to do extra work. It's more like we're changing the way that we do some work in existing meetings.
All right, let's take about 1 more minute on this. All right, so I'll pull up Jill and I, and we have a worksheet that we'll point you to at the end of the session. But Jill and I listed some of our examples, and for advisors contacting all of their advisees, that might be something you look at once a month in grade level team meetings.
All right, so we've gotten to step 4, access to data. So as we know, there's so much work that goes into scheduling and planning data meetings, and nothing really brings them like a standstill, like getting into the meeting and then having to search for the relevant data to answer the questions that have been prioritized. Like, I know I've definitely been in review meetings where we spent half the times like looking for a certain spreadsheet or trying to export and pivot data from a system to answer the question at hand. And so we feel like spending a little bit of time thinking about the data that should be reviewed before heading into a meeting can just save a lot of time and headaches. But this doesn't mean that we think the person leading the meeting should be spending tons and tons of time preparing, these like formal data presentations and doing the analysis for all of the other participants, because that's not sustainable for the person leading the meeting. And it also doesn't provide the opportunity for others to build their own confidence with data review and data literacy. So instead of like spending all this time formally preparing, we recommend some prep that just takes some certain questions into account. So considering these questions, we'll just kind of go through them one by one. So what data points are attendees looking at? So this might be really obvious sometimes, but if you're meeting about a broad topic like attendance, it can be helpful to be really explicit about the metrics. We sort of saw this when we moved from our big broad focus areas to specific questions that are actually answerable. So, if we're looking at attendance, are we looking at percent present? Are we looking at students who are chronically absent? Are we thinking about tardies, or are we more focused on absences? Like, really being explicit about the measures that we're looking at. So for the next one, thinking about where to find this data. So even just taking a minute to get a spreadsheet readily accessible for people, or having a report page screen shared or projected can be a really big time saver. So the next 2 questions get into sort of skills and feelings. So thinking beforehand about whether data needs to be scaffolded. So this can mean helping people get oriented to a chart or graph, or spending a few minutes getting everyone up to speed on a certain measure. And this connects to one of the questions that was asked on Whova, which was, how do you engage audiences with multiple levels of data acumen so that you don't lose teachers through your presentation? So I think sometimes those few extra minutes of scaffolding, such as like adding a visual to explain how a measure is calculated, or even just describing what a chart is showing. So like, here's the x-axis, here's the y-axis, before diving into analysis, can really help people feel more confident and build their data literacy. I also think there's like, tables definitely aren't as pretty sometimes as, you know, charts and graphs, but I think there is oftentimes a desire to sometimes show things in a way that's more complicated than it needs to be. And so really thinking about sort of the most simple way to show your data so that people can access it, look at it, and then feel like they have the knowledge and tools that they need to be able to discuss it moving forward. So the next question, is the data you're reviewing something that people might feel defensiveness about? So especially if we're looking at adult data, like if we're looking at you know, consequences that a teacher has given or phone calls that they have or haven't made. So framing the purpose of review and how this data is being used, I think can really help people feel sort of not defensive about the information that they're looking at. And then that last piece, just being explicit about the goals of the review can help set the tone for a conversation. So are we trying to move to a decision or action in this allocated time, or are we trying to have a more open-ended exploratory conversation? And I think having this goal defined can really be helpful in sort of evaluating whether the meeting was successful at the end. Like, did we get to the action? Did we get to the decision we wanted to make, or are we comfortable sort of having this more free-form discussion? So what we're going to do next, in the next slides, we're going to connect some of our communication questions that you see here to certain data views and talk through which of the access to data questions are relevant in each. I'm going to be using screenshots from some of the reports that can be found in DeansList, but these questions are applicable for any sort of reporting that you're using, whether it's Excel or another system. So for this first view, which students don't have a communication logged for a certain time period? So in this view, there's likely not that much scaffolding we need to do. We can see in this table which students have gone the longest without calls. But I think the opportunity here is to clearly connect this view to action at the start of the meeting. We're not here to discuss why calls to these students haven't been made in a certain period of time, or why it's been really hard to make calls. We're really here to make a plan to ensure that everyone is contacted the next week and to figure out who is best equipped to make those calls. So for the next question, are advisors contacting all of their advisees? So in this view, you can see the percentage of advisees each advisor has contacted in a time period. And some framing here could likely be helpful, especially if this data is coming from school leaders. So even saying something like, we want to make sure that all advisees are receiving calls every week. If you're struggling to contact your advisees, please let us know how we can support you, or reach out to others who you can see are doing really well with this for advice on how they schedule their calls. And so just including 2 sentences of context, I think can really change the tone of a conversation from evaluative to supportive. We're not using this information. You know how we're using this information. We're trying to get a sense of where everybody is so we can make sure that every single student is receiving a contact from their advisor or group leader. So for this next one, do certain groups of students have fewer communications logged than others? In this particular view, we want to compare positive calls for English language learners, former English language learners, and students who are not English language learners. And there's a column in here with the number of students in each of these groups. And as we can see, the group sizes are so different that the total call count wouldn't provide a meaningful comparison to us. So in DeansList, we have the opportunity to switch the measure that we're using over in that total column from just total count of calls to count rate. And in this situation, I think it's very helpful to spend a few extra minutes on what that rate measure actually means to make sure everyone's on the same page. We're taking the total number of calls, we're dividing it by the number of students, and just making sure that everyone feels comfortable with that and why that comparison is important before jumping into the next phase of discussion. And then finally, for this last view, having a clearly defined report can ground a more open-ended question like the one here. So is communication being used effectively for intervention? So in this instance, the scope of the question has been narrowed to using calls as an intervention for students who are failing classes. And so starting with one defined example can sort of help gain an understanding of where students are in this instance, but also potentially lead to the generation of other areas in which communication could be used for positive intervention. So as you're thinking about where the data to answer your key questions is found, we also recommend thinking about which of the questions on this slide are important to consider before a meeting. So